Welcome to our discussion on independent and dependent variables. When we use the word variables in social research, it's because we're interested in how things vary. Variables either change over time, or they differ from place to place, or from individual to individual. For example, there is variation in people's smoking habits. There's variation in laws in different parts of the country. Sometimes there's variation in one's political beliefs over a lifetime. And these are just some examples of variation that might be of interest to the social researcher. We look at variables because we want to explain why things happen. For example, we might want to know why some students have higher GPAs than other students. We might do this by looking at some variables or things that vary within individuals, such as GPA, sleep habits, and study habits. We can describe how these variables relate to each other using the terms independent and dependent variables. So, independent variables are the variables considered to be the cause of something. The word cause is in quotes because some research methods, like randomized controlled experiments, help the researcher to make a stronger causal argument rather than, say, surveys that use correlational analyses. And we're going to talk more about that as the semester wears on. But the independent variable is the one that is manipulated by the researcher in an experiment. And they're the ones that are considered to be the cause. The dependent variable is the variable considered to be the effect. This is the variable measured by the researcher. And one way to remember this relationship is the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. This might be a good phrase to commit to memory to help you. And let's talk about it some more. When we're plotting the independent and dependent variables, we typically put the independent variable on the x-axis and the dependent variable on the y-axis. So in other words, we're putting the cause along the bottom and the effect along the side. So here's an example of plotting of the independent and dependent variable. In this case, I'm making a case that the more you watch Netflix or binge watch Netflix, the lower the GPA. That's my hypothesis. And so when I plot my data, lo and behold, I see it's actually true. So if you look at this graph, and the points are not numbered, but the lower number of hours spent binge watching equals a higher GPA, and GPA drops as binge watching increases. So that's just an example of what it might look like if we were plotting an independent and dependent variable. So often whether a variable is an independent variable or a dependent variable will depend on our hypothesis. In the last example, I hypothesized that binge watching Netflix would adversely affect GPA. But it could be the other way around, that if I have a low GPA, my depression leads me to binge watch Netflix. So there could be a causal direction in the other way, but I don't think so in this case. But as the researcher, you are allowed to specify your hypothesis, where you think the direction is. So if we measure the variables happiness and grades, for example, the independent variable and dependent variable would be completely up to us. We could say that happiness influences the grades that you get. So the more happy I am, the better I'm going to do in school. In this case, grades are the dependent variable. They vary as a result of my level of happiness, which is the independent variable. The grades, we could say on the other side, the grades you get influence your happiness. In other words, if I get an A, my happiness quotient goes up. So in this case, happiness depends on my grades, which are the independent variable. Now, some variables must be independent variables. For example, age and gender cannot be dependent variables, and I'm going to explain why. Your age can't depend on how much you study. However, how much you study can depend on your age. Another restriction is that time and sequence can dictate whether variables are independent variables or dependent variables. So for example, if we measure number 1, how much you study on Wednesday, and then number 2, your test score on Thursday, this time you studied on Wednesday has to be the independent variable because it is going to be what caused the later score on Thursday. How much you study on Wednesday can't depend on your test score on Thursday, in other words. So there are some variables that cannot be dependent variables because they are set, and some variables, because of a time sequence, cannot be dependent variables. Here are some memory tricks for you. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. You can use the letters IN in independent to remind you that the independent variable influences the dependent variable. And finally, the independent variable is the variable that I vary. The IV is the variable that I vary as a researcher. So let's go through some testing of yourself. You hypothesize that sleep influences happiness. That's what you think is the cause and the effect. Identify the independent variable and the dependent variable for this hypothesis. Take a moment to think. All right, the independent variable is sleep. It is going to be the thing that causes the effect of happiness. Happiness is influenced by sleep in this case. Happiness is influenced by sleep. Happiness depends on sleep, and sleep predicts happiness. All right, let's try another. You are given the following variables: loneliness and time spent on Facebook. Which variable is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? Take a moment to think about it. Well, guess what? It's up to you. You could say that loneliness influences how much time people spend on Facebook, or time on Facebook depends on loneliness. And if you say that, then Facebook time is your dependent variable. Loneliness is the independent variable. If you think time spent on Facebook influences loneliness, or that loneliness depends on time on Facebook, then loneliness is your dependent variable and Facebook time is your independent variable. One more test. You were given the following variables: age, alcohol, and alcohol use. Which variable is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? Take a moment to think. The dependent variable is alcohol use and the independent variable is age, because age cannot be a dependent variable. Alcohol use depends on age. No matter how much or how little you drink, your age is not changed by it. Age must be the predictor, the independent variable. So we're at a point where we're wrapping up chapter 1. And as far as this course, you're in good shape if at the end of the week you can do all of the following. So go ahead and read through those. And if you can't do any of those things, you will want to ask some questions on the discussion board. Don't sit in silence. If there's something you're not understanding at this point, please put it out there for the group. And this will wrap up our Chapter 1 lectures, and good luck on the Chapter 1 quiz. And I'll see you for week 2.